Today I'm going to teach you how to flare IRCCM missiles with all three types of flare deployment patterns. There are two types of IRCCM, tracking suspension and gatewidth. Gatewidth missiles include the Magic 2, the R73, the R27T, and the R27ET, whereas tracking suspension is only AIM-9M. First, let's go over a few general tactics that apply to all of the missiles, but some more than others. Firstly is distance. The further away the missile is, the easier it will be to flare. This is especially noticeable on gatewidth IRCCM. Second is heat. All IR missiles are sensitive to temperatures. The colder you can appear, the better, and this is especially important on gatewidth type IRCCM. Turning off afterburner for these missiles is a must. Although tracking suspension missiles do care about your temperature, cutting afterburner is not necessarily a requirement, though it can help. Thirdly, there are a couple things that you can always do to help flare away these missiles. Number one is pre-flaring. Pre-flaring is when you pop flares before the missile is fired at you, which will throw off the seeker's lock. Frequency of flare pops should depend on how certain you are the enemy has a good shot on you and how concerned you are about the potential missile type in the given situation. You can also proactively position yourself or change flight path to make the missile easier to flare, especially so by turning nose in toward the enemy. We'll break this down by flare deployment pattern. Your jet's going to have one of three deployments: NATO, which is straight down flare deployment; Soviet deployment, which is straight up flare deployment; or you could have the Gripen, which is an everywhere deployment for all of the above. You have straight up, straight down, and directly behind your plane. There's a couple others, but these are the three main ones, so we'll focus on these. Let's start with NATO deployment pattern. This is the term I'm using for aircraft with downward firing flares because most NATO top tier jets use this pattern, such as the F-16 and the F-15. They are not the only jets that do so, and some NATO aircraft use other patterns, but F-16 and F-15 is the majority of what you're going to see. Traditionally, you might have flared IRCCM missiles like this. You cut throttle all the way down to lower your engine temperature, drop a few flares, and then they just automatically want to go to your flares due to the temperature differential. However, this is not very reliable as the missiles get very close to you. There are a couple of tricks you can do to flare the gatewidth missiles with this flare deployment pattern. I'm only going to be talking about rear aspect shots because side and front are pretty trivial to flare. If you're having trouble with side and front flaring, it's probably because you're letting them get way too close to you, so try pre-flaring and turn in toward the enemy so that they can't get such a close range shot. The NATO deployment pattern is the most difficult to flare gatewidth missiles with from the rear. Note that in these demonstrations I only use Magic 2s. This is because the Magic 2 and the R73 have the exact same flare resistance, but the Magic is faster, so it closes distance faster. Basically anything that can be done to a Magic 2 can be done to the R73. So what is this trick you're seeing on screen? Well, it's kind of a cope, but it is a way you can get your downward firing flares to give you the same result as if they were deploying upwards, like on Soviet aircraft. The goal is to get your flares between the plane and the missile. You're essentially trying to hide behind a small wall of flares, then escape away from the flares after the seeker has lost sight of you. This will require you to pull into your flares, which is why deploying downward is so problematic. You have to pull negative G's, which doesn't let you get away from the flares very quickly. However, if you do it correctly, it is enough to be reliable. When you go to pull through the flares, you want to pull in the direction the missile is coming from. For example, if the launch is coming from high and to my left, I want to pull through my flares high and left. This will require me to orient my plane accordingly before executing. And this will probably take you about 4 pops of flares, sometimes more or less depending on how good you are at doing it. For AIM-9Ms, things are a bit different. In my findings, the NATO flare pattern is the best for flaring the AIM-9Ms, whereas the Soviet-style upward firing patterns or directly behind patterns are best for flaring gatewidth missiles. Flaring the 9M in front aspect is very easy, so we're going to go straight to rear aspect. You want to try to get the 9M as directly behind you as possible. Being caught somewhere between side aspect and rear aspect is not ideal, though it is still flareable. You should commit to one aspect if possible. From directly behind, I will deploy the flares and combine my pitch and roll controls to do sort of a half circle while deploying the flares. My friend Jay Black calls this a curtain, so that's the phrase I'm going to use. By the way, big thanks to Jay Black for helping me get these clips. He actually streams on Twitch if you guys didn't know, and he's a pretty cool guy. I do think you'd enjoy it if you follow his Twitch, link in the description down below. These are some pretty close range launches, but even then, as long as you can do a real flare curtain, it's pretty consistent and pretty easy to flare. I'm going to let the rest of the example play out. Feel free to skip ahead in the chapters if you want to move on to side aspect. NATO flare deployment also works best against the 9Ms and side aspect scenarios for one big reason, in my opinion: the ability to conserve flares. You want to try to get the 9M as perfectly 90 degrees off of your wingtip as possible and wait for it to get close. Once it's about 1.5 kilometers away, spam the flare key and pitch up or down. I personally like to start inverted and pitch toward the ground. If you don't need to worry about conserving your flares, or you just don't want to risk it, you can start deploying the flares much sooner, maybe 2 kilometers to 1.5 kilometers, somewhere in that range. You don't want to start flaring too early, because then you're just kind of wasting the flares, as there's a good chance the 9M is going to reacquire you. So you want to try to get it in that sweet spot to where it's not so close you can't react, but it's not so far that you're just going to have to keep flaring forever. Have you noticed that my afterburner has been on for all of the previous clips? As mentioned earlier, the AIM-9M does care about temperatures, but as you can see, flaring them with the afterburner on is still very consistent. It is true that turning off the burner should only make it that much easier, so if you want some extra confidence, then try cutting it. It's also useful if you're already going very slow, such as being caught out after a dogfight. Cutting burner may help compensate for the lack of separation your low speed will provide from the flares. Now let's move on to the Soviet-style flare deployment pattern, which is the term I use for flares that fire straight upwards, such as on the MiG-29 and the Su-27. Again, we're going to skip the front and side aspect situation on the Gatewidth missiles and go straight to the rear aspect. Turning off afterburner is a must. The goal is to put a wall of flares between the plane and the missile and pull through it. Upward firing flares make this a lot easier, but like before, you still will want to pull into the direction the missile is coming from. Since we're pulling positive G's now, rather than negative G's, pulling away from the flares is much easier to do, but you've got to be careful, because if you pull too hard, too soon, you might not fool the missile. You might just pull out of your flares way too quickly. I do want to highlight one more time that the key here is to pull into the direction the missile is coming from through your flares. For tracking suspension on AIM-9Ms, rear aspect is definitely easier than side aspect with this flare pattern. All you have to do is flare flower, which is just doing a full aileron roll, or at least close to a full aileron roll, and deploy flares in the process. If that alone doesn't fool the 9M immediately, pull back into some of the flares and continue deploying more. Moving on to the side aspect 9M, the Soviet style flare pattern is probably the worst of the three for side aspect 9M shots. This is the most consistent tactic I've come up with, but if you have any ideas of your own or want to correct something in this video, feel free to leave them in the comments below, so long as you're not a douchebag in how you go about it. To flare side aspect 9M with the Soviet flare pattern, I roll the top of the plane toward the incoming missile. I begin releasing flares around the same 1.5 to 2 kilometer range as before, and make a sudden direction change, preferably up or down. I like going down. Not only do I get the best luck that way, but it also matches my syndrome. I do think it is worth it to try to avoid the side aspect flaring altogether. It is much more reliable to try to force a rear aspect shot or a head-on shot if you have enough time to orient yourself in that position. And lastly, of course, we have the Gripen. This is without a doubt the easiest plane to play at top tier, and largely because of how easy it is to flare these missiles. Whether it be a Gatewidth or an AIM-9, it doesn't matter, you flare it pretty much the same. For Gatewidth missiles, if it's directly behind you like as before, you just want to make a flare flower. If the flare flower doesn't work, which 90% of the time it will, jink back into the flares, fly upside down, backwards, full burner, no burner, do whatever you want, you're a Gripen. It's extremely easy for Gripens to flare all the missiles rear aspect. Side aspect 9Ms isn't quite as easy, but it's not hard. I found that the earlier the better with the Gripen when it comes to flaring the side aspect 9Ms. The principle is the same as before: spam a line of flares, and then after a few pops, make a sudden direction change, preferably of course up or down, and I typically like pitching down. That's pretty much the main points of the video, so I'm going to end it here. I just wanted to make a revised tutorial so that I can stop getting subtweeted in every top tier Defin video. If you found this video helpful, please do share with a friend. I would really appreciate it, and I'll see you later.